Well, now we want to bring attention to a movement called Idle No More that's taking place in Canada. It was started by 4 women and calls on people to protect the land and water by protecting the rights of Canada's Indigenous people. It's a movement that's gaining steam and even inspired protests across the country. This one here was in Manitoba's capital of Winnipeg and is drawing public attention to Canada's Bill C-45, which critics say will challenge Indigenous sovereignty and could lead to extreme harm being done to land and water in the area. Across the United States, Asia, Europe, and New Zealand, large groups of people are showing support for Idle No More. Some of those involved say it's directly connected to others around the world, including the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring and other recent uprisings. Aura Bogado writes about racial justice, native rights, and immigration for The Nation and joins me now to talk more about this. Aura, talk first about what is at the heart of this legislation, Budget Bill C-45. I know it's been pushed here by Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for having me. Well, as you mentioned, for 9 months last year, Canada's Parliament debated Bill C-45. This is a 450-page budget implement omnibus bill. And among some of what it contains are real challenges to Indigenous sovereignty in Canada. Some of what's at stake includes whittling down federal protection for nearly 100% of the rivers in Canada as a way to pave way for the pipelines and the environmental degradation that may come with them.
All right, let me stop you right there because you
Yes.
said something that really stuck out to me when I was looking at some of the numbers. The number of protected lakes, streams, and coastal areas. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that it would go down, those protected areas, from 2.6 million to just 87. Is that possible?
Yes, that is possible under this bill, and is something that is going to imminently be implemented. Something else that's at stake are also key changes to the Indian Act, Canada's Indian Act, and this is something that really has no business being in a budget implementation bill.
You talk about the Indigenous people, their sovereignty really at stake here. Talk about other losers in this case, and also who are the winners? Who would this legislation benefit?
Well, this would definitely benefit corporations. It definitely is, comes from the right-wing supporters, Prime Minister Harper, of course. And the losers are not just First Nations people in Canada. The losers are people even outside of Canada, period. Going back to the Indian Act in and of itself, this is going to make changes to this agreement that First Nations people and Canada's government made quite a long time ago. In exchange for ceding the land, there's certain responsibilities that the Canadian government holds to First Nations people, and by making these sweeping changes in this bill, it really negates the responsibility of that federal government to negotiate with First Nations people.
You talk a little bit about corporations sort of benefiting from this. What's happening in Canada right now that this is so timely in terms of what the future of the country might look like?
Well, I mean, the XL pipeline definitely comes to mind. I'm definitely more familiar with what's going on in the United States in terms of Native rights. But in Canada, there definitely are a lot of corporations that would benefit not only from the Navigable Waters Act that's part of this omnibus bill, but also the Environmental Assessment Act. As it stands right now, if somebody has, if a corporation has a large project that could possibly have environmentally devastating consequences, there is a route through which that needs to be assessed and approved. This omnibus bill essentially takes that away.
Or you wrote about this for The Nation, and you wrote about someone at the center of this movement, Chief Teresa Spence of the Attawapiskat Cree Band. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Chief Spence began a hunger strike about 30 days ago. What's her role in this?
Yeah, so during these 9 months through which Parliament was debating this budget implementation bill and including the changes to the Indian Act, they didn't consult with First Nations leaders. They didn't have any representation during this time. It somehow didn't occur to them, or if it did, no one was brought to the table. And so around the time that this bill ascended, about a month ago, as you mentioned, Chief Spence decided to go on a hunger strike because she felt like this was one way that she wanted to bring attention for her people in particular. In the article that I wrote, I talk about some of the conditions that the people of Attawapiskat deal with in particular. We're talking about a really, really remote area with deep, deep poverty that really shouldn't be a reality in such a rich nation like Canada. And Chief Spence did this as part of a broader movement of Idle No More, which has really caught the imagination of people, Native people in particular in Canada and in the United States, at a time when we don't usually see a lot of activism. The winter holiday of 2012 wasn't supposed to be a time when people were really going to come out into the streets, but we've seen Native people in Canada and the United States really come out and represent themselves in public spaces like parks and malls.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, and what is it about Idle No More that's really not only caught the attention, but really caught the great support from so many people across the world?
Well, I think that we hear a lot about the environment, and I think that this really is an environmental justice issue, and we need to think about the way that Native Americans and Indigenous people in general are always disproportionately negatively affected by environmental degradation. I mean, this comes with the history of colonization and the global north being able to really reap the resources and the land of so many nations. We see that hundreds of years later, it's really global south nations, indigenous global south nations, that stand to imminently and permanently lose their homelands. And if we bring it to a place like the U.S., we're seeing the same thing here. The history of colonization here meant that a lot of people benefited from the land and resources, and a lot of people lost out in that process, Native people in particular, because it was their land.
Absolutely. Ara Bogado, a blogger with The Nation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christine.